The moment we knew that no one was looking at us, I'd shout, "Go!" and Gavin, he was, after all, the boss of our little operation, cried, "Picture!" At this point, he and I would reach out and tear apart the curtain of plastic flowers and greenery. Mike would bring up the camera, the lens literally brushing the sides of our necks in the front, and start shooting through the windscreen. Every frame counted. This was the biggest Soviet military operation since the Second World War, and Mike's film would not only be shown across the world, but stored in the archives forever. The gray snow, the green of the Soviet armor, the dark silhouettes of the Afghans lining the highway, these were the colors and images that would portray the start of this invasion. A glance from a Russian soldier, too long a stare from a military policeman, and Gavin and I would cry, "Down!" Mike would bury his camera between his legs, and we would let the artificial foliage flop back across the inside of the windscreen. Let's be greedy. Gavin kept telling his crew. We all agreed. If we kept our cool, if we didn't become overconfident, if we were prepared to lose a beautiful shot in order to film again another day, then we'd get the story. Above the little village of Sarobi, we stopped the car. Afghanistan's landscape is breathtaking in the most literal sense of the word. Up here, the sun had burned the snow off of the astonishingly light green mountain grass, and we could see for up to 50 kilometers east to the Khyber Pass, to the suburbs of Jalalabad, bathed in mists. For the descent to the valley of the Indus was like walking from a snowstorm into a sauna. Hold your hand out of the window and you could actually feel the air grow warmer. Gavin would literally bounce on his toes as he stood by the road, looking across the panorama of ridges and mountain chains. Far to the north, we could even make out the purple-white snows on the top of the Pamirs. We were that close to China, and we felt, we young men, on the top of the world. The tragedy of this epic had not yet gripped us. How could I have known that 17 years later I would be standing on this very same stretch of road as Osama bin Laden's gunmen prayed beneath that fiery comet? How could I know as I stood with Gavin on that hillside that bin Laden himself, only 22 years old, was at that moment only a few miles from us in the very same mountain chain, urging his young Arab fighters to join their Muslim brothers at war with the Russians? We were halfway down the narrow, precipitous road through the Kabul gorge when a car came toward us, flashing its headlights and skidding to a halt. The driver, unshaven and turbaned, knew only that there was trouble further on down the pass. He raised his hands in a gesture of ignorance and fear then, having vouchsafed this vague intelligence, he drove off behind us at speed. In the mountains of Afghanistan, you do not take such warnings lightly. We all knew what happened in General Elphinstone's British Army in this very gorge in 1842, so when we drove gingerly on down the road, we watched the rocks above us where the snow line ended and the crags gave cover for an ambush. We carried on like this for 15 kilometers without meeting another car until we reached Sarobi, where a group of decrepit old buses and a taxi stood parked beside a barber's shop. There was an Afghan policeman standing in the road, who referred in equally indistinct terms to an ambush ahead. The road had been blocked, he said, so beside the highway with the mountains towering above us and the Kabul River carrying the melted snows in a thrashing torrent down the ravine below, we drank hot, sweet tea until 2 Russian tanks came around the corner, followed by 2 lorry loads of Afghan soldiers. The tanks swept past to the south, their tracks cutting into the tarmac, the radio operators staring straight ahead. The soldiers, each holding a Kalashnikov rifle, gave 2 cheers as they passed through Sarobi, but received no reply. We followed them further down the pass, out of the snow line and into the hot plains, where the sub-zero temperatures and ice of the mountains were replaced by dust and orange groves beside the road. A lorry load of soldiers suddenly pulled across the highway, and we heard gunfire up in the cliffs. We watched the soldiers scrambling up the rocks until we lost sight of them amid the boulders, figures from an old portrait of imperial hostilities in the Khyber. We drove on behind the Russian tanks into the plain, and round a bend we came to a checkpoint and the site of the ambush. For 400 meters, the trees that lined the road had been cut down. There were troops there now, and 2 Russian armored personnel carriers had already come from Jalalabad and cleared most of the road. Tribesmen had fired out of the trees when the first civilian cars had stopped at the roadblock before dawn. They killed 2 people and wounded 9 others, 1 in the back and chest. There was still a litter of glass across the highway, but no one knew whether the tribesmen were bandits or whether they had mistaken the cars for Russian military vehicles in the dark. There was an old man by the road who thought he knew the answer. The men who carried out the ambush, he told us, were mujahideen, holy warriors. Gavin looked at me. We hadn't heard that word in Afghanistan before. It was a reminder that Soviet-backed authorities in Afghanistan could not even secure the main highway to Pakistan. Although we noticed that the Afghan army was still allowed to play an important role in operations, the soldiers who checked our papers through the pass and manned the small concrete forts beside the gorge were all Afghans. Some of the tanks parked in the mountains outside Jalalabad were Afghan too, and only the Afghan army patrolled the city in daylight. Not a Russian was to be seen along the tree-lined, shady streets of this pretty town where horse-drawn carriages rattled with colonial grace over dirt roads, where shoeless peasant boys beat donkeys loaded with grain down to the little market. But the scene was deceptive, and Jalalabad provided an important indicator to what was happening in other, remoter towns in Afghanistan. For despite the delightful serenity of the place, Pathan tribesmen in their thousands were shooting nightly at Afghan troops in the countryside outside Jalalabad. In the past 6 days, explosions had rumbled over the town at night, and 2 large bombs had twice destroyed the electric grid and transformers carrying power into Jalalabad, whose population had had no electricity for 5 days. The curfew had been extended from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., and during those hours of night the Soviet army had been moving heavy armor through the town. There were now 1,400 Russian troops with T-54 tanks and tracked vehicles quartered in the old Afghan army barracks 5 kilometers east of Jalalabad on the road to Pakistan. If the Afghan army could not keep the peace, it seemed that the Russians were preparing to step in and pacify the countryside. We drove back to Kabul before dusk and tried to visit the Russian-built military hospital. Through the iron fences, we could see soldiers with their arms in slings, walking with the aid of sticks or crutches. More ominously, a turboprop Aeroflot aircraft was parked at a remote corner of the Kabul airport, and when we drove close to it, we could make out a Russian military ambulance next to a loading ramp at the front of the fuselage. In the years to come, the Russians would give a nickname to the aircraft that flew their dead home from Afghanistan: the Black Tulip. Within 8 years, the Russians would lose 14,263 combatants, dead and missing, and bring home 49,985 wounded. In the years to come, Gavin and I would remember our journeys out of Kabul in 1980 as a great adventure. We were a hunting party, off for an exciting day in the quest for images. We adopted the elderly Russian-built grain silo outside Kabul as a symbol of the Soviet Union's gift to the world. It represented, we thought, about 1/1,000,000th of the Soviet Union's gifts. There was an innocence about our world. Gavin would recall more than 20 years later. The grain silo was somehow typical. The more crumbling his presence, the more true our images were to their art form. Traveling with this crew, I became almost as possessive of their filmed report, as anxious to see them get a scoop a day for the BBC as Gavin himself. For his part, Gavin wanted to ensure that I sent my reports for the Times safely out of Kabul each day. Our enthusiasm to help each other was not just journalistic camaraderie. Gavin was one of the only television reporters to reach Afghanistan, and his dramatic film dispatches were shaping the world's perception of the Soviet invasion. William Rees-Mogg, the editor of the Times, and the deputy news editor, Ivan Barnes, watched all Gavin's reports, though they often took 48 hours to reach the screen. There were no satellite feeds in Kabul, and we were forbidden to bring satellite dishes into the country. So Jeff Hale was hand-carrying cans of film out of London, commuting back and forth from Kabul every day, a 13,500-kilometer round trip at least 3 times a week. Gavin found that his own editors were reading my reports every day in the Times, and eagerly waited for the pictures which they knew he would have, since Gavin had told them we traveled together, and his filmed reports were feeding my own editor's hunger for news from Afghanistan. We were 2 parasites we used to claim living off each other's work. My own copy was reaching the Times in less expensive but almost equally exhausting form. The Intercontinental staff were instructed by the Afghan State Security Police not to allow journalists to send their reports over the hotel telex. I was thus reduced to sending messages to Ivan Barnes and to the deputy editor, Louis Heron, indicating how I planned to get my dispatch to London. Our New York and Washington bureaus were trying to call me by phone, so was Binyan in Moscow. But in all the weeks I spent in Kabul, I never received a single telephone call from anyone. Instead, I would wake up at 4 each morning and type up 5 copies of my story for the Times. I would give 1 copy to the Reuters news agency, which sent an Indian staffer to Delhi almost every day. I gave another copy to Reuters' Pakistani staffer, who regularly flew to Peshawar and Islamabad. From there, they were asked to punch out my text and, since the paper subscribed to the news agency, send it to London. Another copy went to anyone traveling to the Soviet Union in the hope they would contact Binyan in Moscow. A fourth carbon went to Jeff for his regular flights to Britain. The 5th was for a much more devious operation, one which, and still today, I marveled that it worked. Involved the Pakistani conductor of the daily old wooden bus that bumped down from Kabul to Jalalabad and on to Peshawar in Pakistan, where local hotel staff were standing ready to telex my pages to London. I set the scheme up my 3rd morning in Kabul. I had noticed the Peshawar bus on the highway south of the capital and learned that it left Kabul each morning at 6:30. I liked Ali, the conductor, an immensely cheerful Pathan with a green scarf and a round Afghan hat and a smile of massive, pure white teeth, who spoke enough English to understand both my humor and my cynicism. Mr. Robert, if this hurts the Russians, I will carry your report to the very door of the Intercontinental Hotel in Peshawar. You give me money to pay their operators, and when you leave Afghanistan, you will go to Peshawar with me and pay the telex bills. Trust me. All my life in the Middle East, people have ordered me to trust them, and almost always I did, and they were worthy of that trust. Ali received $50 a day, every day, to take my typed dispatch to Peshawar. The operators received $40 a day to telex it to London. Even in the worst blizzards, down the Kabul Gorge, Ali's ancient bus made it through the snowdrifts and the Russian checkpoints. Sometimes I traveled with him as far as Jalalabad. The Afghan army had been told to stop journalists roaming the country in cars, but they never thought to check the bus. So I would sit on the steps with Ali as we puttered and rocked down the Kabul gorge, feeling the warmth of the countryside as we descended into the Indus Valley. I would stay at the Springhar Hotel in Jalalabad, spend the morning driving into the rural villages in a motorized rickshaw, a cloth-covered cabin mounted on the back of a motorcycle, to investigate the results of the overnight fighting between the Russians and the Mujahideen, and then pick up Ali's return bus to Kabul and in the afternoon. Ali never lost a single report. Only when I received a telegram from the Times did I realize how well he did his job. Many thanks. Files stop Tuesday's lead paper. Wednesday's convoy front page stop.
What you doing?
When journalists have to smuggle their dispatches out of a country, they traditionally call the carrier a pigeon. Ali was the best pigeon the Times ever had, his old bus its finest transport. And when one night in the bar of the Kabul Intercontinental, a reporter from the Daily Mail admitted he had received a telegram from his editors in London with the angry demand, "Does Fisk have cleft stick?" I added $100 to Ali's next payment. Slowly, Gavin and I enlarged our area of operations. 150 kilometers southwest of Kabul lay the more than 100,000-year-old city of Ghazni. Clustering round the giant battlements of a Turkish fort destroyed by the British in the First Afghan War, a settlement on the road to Kandahar, which was successfully destroyed by Arab invaders in 869, and again by Genghis Khan in 1221. The Soviet army, we were told, had not yet reached Ghazni, so we took the highway south past the big Soviet guns that ringed Kabul, and a European face beneath a Cossack-style hat waved at us, unsmiling through the last Russian checkpoint. Gavin and I were working our plastic foliage routine, pulling aside the ghastly purple and blue artificial flowers whenever a Soviet tank obligingly crossed our path, so that Mike could run another 2 or 3 feet of film. At the tiny, windy village of Saidabad, 70 kilometers down the road, more Russian tanks were dug in beside the highway, their barrels pointing west, dwarfing the poor mud and wattle huts in which the villagers lived. There was a bridge guarded by 4 soldiers with bayonets, fixed, and then there was just an empty, unprotected road of ice and drifting snow that stretched down towards the provinces of Paktia and Ghazni. The old city, when Gavin and his crew and I turned up in Mr. Samadali's Pugo, looked like a scene from a medieval painting. Walled ramparts set against the snow-smothered peaks of the Safed Ku Mountains, and pale blue skies that distorted all perspective. Indeed, there were no Russians, just a series of Afghan army lorries that trundled every half hour or so down from the north to the Ghazni barracks, their red Afghan insignia a doubtful protection against attack by rebel tribesmen, their scruffily dressed drivers peering nervously from the cab, the Afghan army notionally loyal to its new president and his Soviet allies, theoretically controlled the countryside, although it was clear the moment we entered Ghazni that some form of unofficial ceasefire existed between the local soldiers and the Pathan tribesmen, Afghan troops in sheepskin cloaks and vests. Ghazni is famous for the manufacture of such embroidered pustin coats, were wandering the narrow mud streets looking for provisions beneath their turreted, crumbling barracks. Almost 1,000 years ago, Mahmud of Ghazni imposed his rule over most of Afghanistan, devastated northwest India, and established an Islamic empire that consolidated Sunni Muslim power over thousands of square miles. Ghazni became one of the great cities of the Persian world, whose 400 resident poets included the great T.G.W.C. But the city was now a mockery of its glorious past. Some of the battlements had long ago collapsed, and ice had cracked the ancient walls in the sub-zero temperatures. Isolated from the outside world, its inhabitants were suspicious of strangers, a dangerous and understandable obsession that had reached a new intensity now that reports of the Soviet invasion had reached the city. We had scarcely parked our car when a tall man with long gray mustache approached us. "Are you Russian?" he asked, and a group of Pathans in blue and white headdress began to gather around the car. We told them we were English, and for a moment or so there were few friendly smiles. Gavin and I were too developed our own special smile for these people, a big, warm smile of delight, to hide our dark concern. "How good to see you. What a wonderful country. My God, how you must hate those Russians." All of us knew how quickly things could go wrong. It was only a few months since a group of Soviet civilian construction workers had their wives had decided to visit the blue-tiled Masjid Jami Mosque in Herat, a place of worship since the time of Zoroaster, only to be seized by a crowd and knifed to death. Several of the Russians were skinned alive. Only the previous day, though I did not know it then, the Times had published a photograph of two blindfolded men in the hands of Afghan rebels. They were high school teachers detained in the city of Farah, 300 kilometers west of Kandahar, and the man on the right of the picture had already been executed as a communist. Mr. Samadali needed oil for his pugo, and from a cluttered, dirty concrete-floored shop an old man produced a can of motor oil. Horses and carts and donkeys, staggering under stacks of grain, slithered through the slush and mud, and then someone muttered, "Car," and the smiles all faded. Kahar means donkey, and though apparently humorous on first hearing, it is a term of disgust and hatred when used about foreigners. "They are calling you Kahar," Mr. Samadali said desperately. "They cannot tell the difference between Englishmen and Russians. They do not want foreigners here. You must go." A larger group of Pathans had now arrived, and stood in a line along a raised wooden pavement beside the street. There were no guns in their hands, although two had long knives in their belts. A middle-aged man came up to us. "Leave here now," he said urgently. "Don't stop for anyone. If you are stopped by people on the road, drive through them. You are foreigners, and they will think you are Russians and kill you. They will find out who you are afterwards." We left Ghazni at speed. Were we really in danger? More than 21 years later, I would confront an almost identical group of angry Afghans, and, almost at the cost of my life, I would discover just what it meant to incur their fury. Frightening off strangers was one thing. Fighting a well-equipped modern army would be quite another. On the road north again, we noticed, high on the hillsides and deep in the snow, a series of metal turrets with gun barrels poking through them. The Russians had already taken physical control of the highway, even though they did not stand beside the road. Soviet tanks had been parachuted into the mountains north of Kabul, and the artillery outside Ghazni had also been dropped from the air. Our plastic foliage twitched aside as we cleared the windscreen for Mike. We were becoming experts. Indeed, it was Gavin's contention that the Russians would inevitably learn about our stage-prop jungle and assume that all modern movies were produced like this, that a new generation of Soviet filmmakers would insist on shooting all future productions through car windows stuffed with artificial purple flowers. And there were plenty more to film in Afghanistan. Even before we arrived, the Karmal government had attempted to slink back into popular support by freeing Amin's political prisoners. But when the city prison in Kabul was opened, thousands of men and women arrived to greet their loved ones and began throwing stones at the young Soviet troopers around the walls. No one doubted that the previous regime was detested by the population. The newly installed Karmal officials lost no time in letting us know of their hatred. This, after all, was why we had been given visas to come to Afghanistan. In Peshawar, rebel groups had claimed that the Afghan army would fight the Russian invaders, but the 7th and 8th Afghan divisions in Kabul, both of which were equipped with Soviet tanks, never fired a shot against Russian armor. Their Soviet advisors had seen to that. On the 11th of January, however, the government's propaganda went disastrously wrong. Thousands of Afghans, relatives of inmates, many of them in long cloaks and turbans, gathered this time outside the Pole-Charki prison, a grim fortress of high stone walls, barbed wire, jail blocks, and torture cells, to witness the official release of 118 political prisoners. But enraged that so few had been freed, the crowd burst through an Afghan army cordon and broke open the iron gates. We ran into the prison with them, a Russian soldier next to me, almost thrown off his feet. He stared transfixed by the sight as men and women, the latter in the all-covering burqa, began shouting, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," through the outer compound and began to climb over the steel gates of the main prison blocks. Gavin and I looked at each other in wonderment. This was a religious as much as it was a political protest. On the roof of a barracks, a young Soviet officer with a Kalashnikov rifle began shouting in Russian that there were only 8 people left inside the prison. Connor O'Clery of the Irish Times was in the yard in his big Russian greatcoat. He was based in Moscow and spoke good Russian, and he turned to me with his usual irredeemable smirk. "That guy may claim there are only 8 men left," he said. "I suspect we're going to find out he's lying." For a moment the crowd paused as the officer swung his rifle barrel in their direction. Then he heeded him no more, and surged on through the second, newly broken gate. Hopelessly outnumbered, the soldier lowered his weapon. Hundreds of other prisoners' relatives now smashed the windows of the cell blocks with rocks and used steel pipes to break in the doors of the first building. 3 prisoners were suddenly led into the winter sunlight by their liberators, middle-aged men in rags, thin and frail, and dazed and blinking at the snow and ice-covered walls. A young man came up to me in the prison as crowds began to break in the roof of a second concrete cell block. "We want Russians to go," he said in English. "We want independent Afghanistan. We want families released. My brother and father are here somewhere." I squeezed into the cell block with the mob, and there were certainly more than the 8 prisoners to which the Russian officer referred. Blankets had been laid on the stone floor by the inmates as their only protection against extreme cold. There was a musty, stale smell in the tiny, airless cells. Across the compound, other prisoners waved through the bars of windows, screaming at the crowd to release them. One man, in baggy peasant trousers, bashed open a hatch in the metal roof of a cell and slid inside, shouting to his friends to follow him. at the bottom it says here, literally, God is greatest, or God is the greatest. Because in English the expression is greatest tends to be used about football teams rather than a divinity, I have used the less accurate but more traditional God is great, which more powerfully reflects the faith to Western ears. Whew. I climbed through a window in the end of the same cell block and was confronted by at least 20 men, sitting on the floor amid chains and straw, eyes wide with horror and relief. One held out his hand to me. It was so thin I felt only his bones. His cheeks were sunken and blue, his teeth missing, his open chest covered in scars, and all this while the Russian soldiers and the Afghan guards stood watching, unable to control the thousands of men and women, aware that any public bloodletting would cause irreparable damage to the Karmal regime. Some of the crowd abused the Russians, and one youth, who said he was from Paktia province, screamed at me that Russians are bombing and killing in South Afghanistan. But the most notable phenomenon about this amazing prison break-in were the Islamic chants from the crowds. Several men shouted for an Islamic revolution, something that Russians had long feared in Afghanistan and in their own Muslim republics. Many of the youths looking for their relatives came from rural areas to the south of Kabul, where a tribal rebellion had been growing for at least 14 months. Altogether, the government had released more than 2,000 political prisoners in the previous 2 weeks. It was Babrak Karmal's first act as president, but the decision had the unintended effect of reminding the crowds of how many thousands of political prisoners were not being released, inmates who had long ago been executed under Amin. Only in the early afternoon did Soviet soldiers form a line inside the main gate of Polecharki, with rifles lowered, apparently to prevent the hundreds of men and women from leaving. Connor pulled his greatcoat around him, hands in pockets, the very model of a modern KGB major general, and walked straight up to the nearest officer in the line of troops. Dos vidanya, he said in Russian. The officer and another soldier snapped smartly to attention, and we walked out of the jail. Down here it says, True to the maxim that no prison ever loses its original purpose, Polecharki was the scene of post-Taliban Afghanistan's first judicial execution in April 2004. The death sentence of the bandit was signed by the country's pro-American Pushtun president Hamid Karzai. That same day, Babrak Karmal held his first press conference, a dismal affair in which the new Soviet-installed president, the son of a high-ranking Pushtun army officer, a heavily built man with a prominent nose, high cheekbones, and graying hair, with the manners of a nightclub bouncer, denounced his socialist predecessor as a criminal and insisted that his country was no client kingdom of the Soviet Union. This was a little hard to take when the main door of the Cheltoon Palace, in which this miserable performance was taking place, was guarded by a Soviet soldier with a red star on his hat, when a Russian tracked armored vehicle stood in the grounds, and when a Soviet anti-aircraft gun crew waited in the snow beside their weapons, 100 meters from the building. So when Babrak Karmal told us that the only thing brighter than sunshine is the honest friendship of the Soviet Union, one could only regard it as a uniquely optimistic, if not Olympian, view of a world that Dr. Faustus would have recognized. Even the Afghan officials, clustered beside Karmal, however, must have wished wished for the presence of some subtle Mephistopheles to soften the rhetoric as the president's press conference descended into an angry and occasionally abusive shouting match. The questions that the Western journalists put to Karmal were often more interesting than his replies, but highlights of the affair had to include the following statements by Moscow's new man, that not one Soviet soldier had been killed or wounded since the Russian military intervention began. That the size of the very limited Soviet contingent sent to Afghanistan had been grossly exaggerated by the imperialist Western press. That the Soviet Union had supported the brutal regime of the late Hafizullah Amin, because the Soviet Union would never interfere in the internal affairs of any country, and finally that Soviet troops would leave Afghanistan at the moment that the aggressive policy of the United States, in compliance with the Beijing leadership and the provocation of the reactionary circles of Pakistan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, is eliminated. The full flavor of the press conference, however, could only be captured by quoting extracts. Martin Lewis of ITN, for example, wanted to know about Karmal's election to the presidency after his predecessor had been overthrown in a coup. Lewis: I wonder, could you tell us when and under what circumstances you were elected? And, if that election was truly democratic, why is it that Russian troops had to help you to power? Karmal: Mr. Representative of British imperialism, don't lie. The imperialism that 3 times blatantly invaded Afghanistan. You got a rightful and deserved answer from the people of Afghanistan. This exchange was followed by a burst of clapping from Afghan officials and Soviet correspondents. Only after this excursion into 3 Afghan wars of the 19th and early 20th centuries did Karmal reply to Lewis, telling him that during the Amin regime, an overwhelming majority of the principal members of the People's Democratic Party, PDP, of Afghanistan had elected him president. At the bottom it says, Lewis later went on to anchor ITN's evening news in London, but also indulged himself by writing books about dogs and cats, a pastime that was probably more rewarding than reporting Karmal's press conference. We had, of course, expected no less of Karmal, and his courageous, some might say foolhardy, assertion that a true non-alignment for Afghanistan can be obtained with the material and moral help of the Soviet Union, accurately reflected Moscow's point of view. The new man was once a bitter opponent within the PDP of Nur Mohammad Taraki, the assassinated president whose martyrdom Karmal now blamed on the CIA, and Gavin Hewitt experienced firsthand what it was like to be on the receiving end of the new dictator's anger. For when Gavin commented mildly that there doesn't seem to be much support for you or the Russians in Afghanistan, Karmal drew in his breath and bellowed the first response that came into his head. Mr. Correspondent of the BBC, the most famous propaganda liar in the world, he roared. That was all. The room collapsed in applause from the satraps around Karmal and uncontrollable laughter from journalists. Well, I told Gavin, old Babrick can't be that bad a guy. At least he got you down to a T. Gavin shot me a sidelong grin. Just wait, Fiskars, he muttered. And he was right. Within hours, Karmal's absurd reply had gone round the world, proving that Moscow's new man in Kabul was just another factotum with a single message. And I'm going to end it there for the day.